He's the Distinguished Professor of Meteorology and the Director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State University, and the recipient of this year's, essentially, the Nobel Prize for the Environment. It's called the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. He's the author of several books, most recently, The Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy. His website, Mann, with 2 N's.net. And you can tweet him. He's on Twitter. I don't have his Twitter handle right here in front of me, but I just retweeted him this morning, so you can easily find that. Dr. Mann, welcome back.
Thanks, Thom. It's Michael E. Mann at Twitter, and it's great to be back with you.
Thank you very much. The climate crisis coming. We have Anchorage, 90 degrees. Today, this one of the many things that press conference is being held. In fact, I think it has already happened with Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Earl Blumenauer earlier today, or maybe it will be happening shortly. I'm missing page 2 of the press release and that's where it says when. But basically, they're calling for they're introducing a resolution in Congress calling for the United States to declare a climate emergency, as has New York City has done. Over 700 governments in 16 countries have done so. What is the state of our climate right now, and how does what's going on in Alaska and the massive droughts that are happening, this 5-year drought down in Honduras and Nicaragua, which are driving refugees to our southern border, how do these things relate to climate as opposed to weather?
Yeah, so indeed, in a very real sense, we are seeing a climate emergency. The fact is that we are now witnessing truly dangerous impacts of climate change on our everyday lives. The extreme weather events that we're seeing around the world over the past several years, and this summer here in the United States and elsewhere around the Northern Hemisphere, once again, unprecedented wildfires and floods and heat waves are a reminder that the climate crisis has arrived, and it's an emergency in the sense that we are not acting to the extent necessary to avert ever-worsening impacts of climate change. We have to do far more. We have to get off the burning of fossil fuels. We need to move toward renewable energy. And here in the United States, of course, we're going in the wrong direction under the current administration, under the Trump administration, which in fact is dismantling the progress that we had made in recent years.
Yeah, I'm a member of AAAS, and so I get Science, and I get their newsletter, and I subscribe to Nature, and I don't recall which of those 2 publications this was in earlier this week, but a rather extensive article suggesting that if we just had a worldwide effort at planting trees in areas where it's actually quite easy to plant trees, that could suck up as much as 1/3 of all the carbon that has been introduced into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. Am I remembering that right? Are you familiar with that report?
I did see that study and the widespread news reports, some of which, in fact, exaggerated the conclusions of that study. Mm-hmm. It's important to keep these studies in context. Rarely is there one study that comes out and dramatically changes our understanding. This latest study is just another study in a whole series of studies in recent years that demonstrate that there is the potential to take some of the carbon that we are pumping into the atmosphere back out of the atmosphere through reforestation and other means. But here's the thing, that conclusion that we've heard repeated, that trees could take up to 1/3 of the carbon pollution we're putting into the atmosphere, that's based on the rosiest of assumptions. Essentially, it assumes that just about every possible square area, square meter of land around the world is used for reforestation, that we basically take all the available land that might need to be used for agriculture and other purposes and assign it to, and reforest that land. And so that is probably an exaggerated estimate of how much reforestation we could do. My guess is that you probably have to cut that figure in half or maybe in thirds. Maybe we're really only talking in practice in terms of what we could practically do, uptaking about 10% of the carbon pollution we're putting into the atmosphere. What that means is that this is not a panacea. This is not the silver bullet. This will help out a little bit, and everything we do can help out a little bit. But ultimately, if we do not dramatically lower our burning of fossil fuels, if we do not rapidly move away from a fossil fuel-driven economy, there's no amount of reforestation or natural carbon capture that is going to prevent the ever increasing levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the ever worsening impacts of climate change.
We're seeing the Arctic melting right now. I mean, to the point that, excuse me, I had to sneeze, to the point that, you know, countries are starting to fight over who has shipping lanes and things like that. I mean, literally, we're seeing the Arctic melting. And it's obviously, you and I have had this conversation for several years now, how it's affecting our weather and things like that. But, you know, there's also this concern that as the permafrost melts, it releases enormous amounts of carbon in the form of both methane and carbon dioxide, that there are carbon stores, you know, clathrates and whatnot in the Arctic. At what point, and then, you know, we're seeing Anchorage at 90 degrees, is passing the tipping point in that part of the world in a way that is irrevocable and could be, you know, radically destructive. Is that one of the major tipping points that the IPCC is pointing to when they said, I think it was a year or two ago, that we had 10 to 12 years basically to get this thing under control?
Yeah, so first of all, you know, one of the impacts of climate change is actually a spread in allergies. And so I'm not going to blame climate change on your sneeze.
It may well be.
That is one of the impacts of climate change, human health impacts, including more widespread allergies.
Yeah, this is the first time in my life that I've started sneezing, you know, when the trees are flowering and things. Anyhow, back to you.
Well, there you go. You know, yeah. I'm not going to say it proves the point. But seriously, you talked about some of the wider implications of, you know, if we exceed the typically cited level of about 1.5 degrees Celsius warming of the planet, that number that you cited, the 12-year number, basically, how long do we have to decrease carbon emissions by a factor of 2? You know, how long do we have to do that before we commit to, you know, catastrophic levels of warming, 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 degrees Celsius warming? And basically, we've got to lower them by between 5 and 10% a year for the next decade and beyond. And so that ties into this 12-year number. Otherwise, we warm the planet more than 1.5 degrees Celsius and pretty soon more than 2 degrees Celsius. There are tipping points that lie out there, and some of them we may have passed. We may have warmed the oceans enough and destabilized the ice shelves of Antarctica enough to eventually lock in not just feet, but meters of sea level rise, 20 feet of sea level rise. We may be very close, if not having already passed that no return, where we guarantee massive flooding of the world's coastlines. And if we're lucky, even if we do guarantee that, it happens over centuries, and so we can slowly adapt and retreat to those changes. If we're unlucky, it could happen quite a bit faster. Now, there are other tipping points that have been discussed that do relate directly to Arctic warming. There's a lot of methane that's stored in the Arctic in the permafrost in the form of what's known as clathrate, and we know that if there's enough warming of the Arctic, the melting of the permafrost, that methane could be released into the atmosphere, and methane is an even more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So it's what we refer to as an aggravating feedback. It can add to the warming. There's no evidence yet. The science doesn't support the notion that we're close to a tipping point where such massive amounts of methane will be released that it will overwhelm the warming effect of the CO2 that is arising in the atmosphere because of the burning of fossil fuels. So the first order effect, and we have to keep our eye on the ball here, is the continued burning of fossil fuels, the elevation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the warming that's creating. But there are potential exacerbating feedbacks, and the Arctic in particular is a region that's warming faster than the rest of the planet because of the melting of ice and more absorption of the incoming sunlight. It's another one of those aggravating feedbacks. The Arctic warms faster than the rest of the planet. That means we're seeing impacts up there long before we're going to see those same impacts down here. It's a harbinger of what we can expect, that record heat, baked Alaska, as I referred to it on Twitter. This record heat in Alaska is indicative of what's to come and what's already happening down here in the lower 48. And one other thing, when you warm the Arctic and you melt the ice, it turns out there's increasing evidence now, scientific evidence, that can change the jet stream. It can change it in a way that gives us those stuck weather patterns like we've seen last summer and this summer, those very persistent high pressure and low pressure systems that just won't move along. And so you get unprecedented heat, drought, and wildfire out west, or back here, back east, unprecedented amounts of rainfall when you're stuck under one of those low pressure centers. And those highs and lows get larger and they get stuck in place. And that's a linkage we increasingly understand actually relates to the melting of the ice up in the Arctic. What happens in the Arctic, as we like to say, doesn't stay in the Arctic. It's impacting us down here.
And I think the first time you and I had a conversation about this, there was a woman who was not a climate scientist who had made this proposal. She was a mathematician, as I recall, and it was about 5 or 6 years ago. And we were both, correct me if I'm wrong, at least I was like, oh, this is a novel theory. And now it seems to have been proven.
Yeah, well, some of the early work in this area was done by Jennifer Francis of Rutgers, and I forget what her actual background is, but certainly her work, she was sort of at the leading edge of pointing out these connections in sort of a heuristic manner. And over time, what's happened is there's been quite a bit of detailed science that backs her up. She appears to have been prescient.